Hi, guys. Thank you so much for joining us at A Dram of Diving for another month of exciting topics. Uh, I am Allie. I'm the manager at Deep Stop Scuba, and I also teach some classes on the side for fun. Today, we are going to be talking about shark culling. We got some feedback that we should do some more controversial topics, so we figured we should just go for it. So today I have one or two guests with us. Right now we've got Amanda, and she's going to come out and introduce herself. And hopefully later on we'll have Chris, who's a shark biologist as well. And hopefully he will be joining us in a few minutes. So here is Amanda, if you want to introduce yourself.
All right. Hi, everyone. Like Allie said, my name is Amanda. I'm originally from Cicero, New York, right down the road from Deep Stop, but I have been around a lot for the ocean because I have a master's in marine biology. So I've had the opportunity to visit some really beautiful places for my job as a marine science and dive instructor for a company called Semester. Basically, it's a study abroad program for college students, and we take them all throughout the world to really beautiful places like the Galapagos, Fiji, Palau, Indonesia, the Mediterranean. So I've had great opportunities to see sharks in their natural habitat. So I'm really excited for this topic that Allie has chosen.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us. We are just going to get into it. So, like I said, we are talking about shark culling. Before I forget, I've got some Woodford Reserve tonight. Amanda, are you drinking anything tonight?
I'm not drinking anything tonight.
No.
I got an early morning in the morning.
That's okay. Busy.
Yeah.
Cool. So, first of all, I was hoping that you could give us like your definition of culling. Not everyone might have a great idea of what that is. So I grabbed a definition from Webster's dictionary online. But why don't you give us yours first?
Yeah, so culling, to my understanding, is the deliberate killing of a group of organisms. In this case, we're talking about shark culling. It's usually government sanctioned, so it is not recreational fishing like for like those big fish out there on the water. This is deliberate killing for a cause that the government has deemed necessary. A lot of times with sharks, it is to minimize their presence in coastal waters. So it is trying to minimize populations, usually of apex predators, for some reason or another.
Yeah, that's exactly what I have for the most part. Honestly, a little bit more specific, which is great. I had culling is to reduce or control the size of something by removal, as by hunting or slaughter of especially weak or sick individuals. So that's what Webster says about culling. And we have Dr. Chris Lowe with us, so I'm going to bring him into the stream right now. Hi, Chris. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. So we are live. If you want to take a minute to introduce yourself to our viewers.
Sure. My name is Dr. Chris Lowe. I'm a professor of marine biology and the director of the Shark Lab at Cal State Long Beach. I actually grew up in Martha's Vineyard, and I started diving when I was 17. I don't want to tell you how old I am, but horse collars were all the rage. So I've been diving basically that entire time. So I've logged, 3,000 dives in my career, and have been fortunate enough to dive all over the world with sharks, which is kind of cool. And right now we're doing a big project in California looking at white sharks and how they interact with people along our beaches.
That is really cool. We will probably almost definitely ask about more details on that later. I didn't even think about talking about our diving history. It is a diving podcast. Amanda, do you want to give us your background in diving?
Sure, of course. So I started diving when I was 18. I learned actually on Semester, which is the company I work for now, but I learned as a student down in the Caribbean back in 2015. And I fell in love, and I just kept going with it as I continued my education through my master's. and I used it. I became a dive master while I did my master's in UNCW down in North Carolina. And there I got to use scuba to observe some zooplankton vertical migration off the piers there. And now I'm an instructor for both PADI and SDI thanks to Deep Stop Scuba. And I get to take my students diving wherever our boats are located. So that's included Palau, Indonesia, the Caribbean a lot, even the cold Azores off the coast of Portugal, which was like very cold for me. But yeah.
That's awesome. I am the newest diver here. I've been diving for just a little over 2 years now, and I have been instructing with SDI and Deep Stop Scuba for a little bit over a year. I have been lucky enough in that time to dive with some sharks, though, so I've been pretty happy with that. Cool. So I had just asked Amanda to give us her definition of culling, and I just wanted to see if you offhand have like a good definition that you usually think of as a go-to for the term culling.
For me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I already answered.
Sure. So culling, typically the term used in shark culling is for the purpose of reducing the population so that it's so small that your probability of having a negative shark interaction with a person is very low. So the early days of shark culls were to just simply reduce the number of sharks, thinking that that would reduce the probability of injury. We've learned a long time ago that that doesn't work. There are places that still shark cull, like South Africa and Australia. They call it netting. Basically, it's culling. But the concern isn't so much the loss of sharks, because it has worked in reducing bites in those locations. The biggest concern are the ecological impacts, because they kill turtles and whales and birds and everything else. So the problem is they're very expensive programs. They've been going on for 50 years. They've been successful in terms of reducing injury and not impacting tourism. So therefore, it is an addiction that they're struggling to give up.
I like how you put that. So just going off of that, I know that what is your guys' personal opinion, both opinion and based on studies that you've seen on shark culling and their impact? I know you said it's been successful in reducing bites, but has a negative impact on the environment around those areas. Do you guys want to talk a little bit more about that, about your personal feelings about shark culling?
Sure. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, obviously, we love seeing sharks on our dives, so it's a really big bummer to have learned about and seen the effects of shark culling, and just the reduction of shark populations. I mean, I think since the 70s, they've had like a 70% depletion of populations, and they're so important to be indicators for reef health. Whenever you're on a reef and you don't see any, it's really a poor sign of the overall health of that reef, because they are the apex predators. So if you do see them hanging around, it means that that reef can sustain those apex predators. But due to their depletion in population, it has had like repercussions down the ecological web, which can hinder like the growth and just overall health of that ecosystem that they're supposed to be in.
Yeah. Chris, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so we have been trying to look at that exact thing. So there's been a big group of shark scientists that get together this summer to address the ecological role of sharks. And despite the fact that it sounds intuitive, like they're important predators, and if you lose the predators, you'll have this trophic cascade. Surprisingly, scientifically, there's not a lot of evidence for that. So it sounds logical, right? It makes ecological sense, but it doesn't necessarily pan out, because what we found is that in many coral reefs, if you remove reef sharks, which has already happened, usually due to overfishing, they're replaced by other mesopredators. We call those middle predators, right? So they're replaced by jacks and they're replaced by snappers, unless they're fished out, in which case, you're losing much of the other cast of characters that would come in and fill the shark's role, right? And very few reefs have what we call apex predators, true apex predators, like tiger sharks and things like that. And the other thing that we're learning is that once protections are put in place, the resilience of those populations is actually pretty impressive. Like, they can recover fairly quickly. And we're seeing that in many places in the US. So despite the fact that many populations have been overfished, protections were put in place. And now it took about 25 years on the Atlantic, but we're seeing many of our coastal populations come back. And that is creating a new problem, which is now people are seeing sharks in the water, and now they're worried about that. So you've probably heard off New York and Cape Cod and all those places, there's concern about sharks in the water. Of course, sharks are always in the water, but as their populations come back, people are seeing them more. So the next question, the one that we're focusing on in California, is what does that mean for people? Does that really pose a safety risk? And there's a lot of misconception or misinformation about the danger of sharks. And of course, people that spend any time in the water with them know that that's a misconception. But convincing the rest of the public that is a little difficult when you have things like Shark Week. So, there's a lot of really cool new science going on that I think will do a lot to change people's opinions. But we're battling against programming that still likes to show sharks in a scary way.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Shark Week I feel like it used to be a little bit more educational, but it's definitely enjoying the scare factor right now. So you guys have covered really great points about the possible downsides of shark culling. I have some questions about some possible plus sides of it, and I just want to see what you guys think. So you had mentioned that there are some areas where those nets, the gill nets, and things like that are put out by certain countries have been successful in reducing shark attacks. How do you guys feel about the importance of protecting people on beaches versus saving a few extra sharks to go around in the oceans?
Go ahead.
That is such a tricky question, because obviously you never want to put human safety at risk, but at the same time they are entering the shark's home, like their natural habitat, where they do need, like, they do want food. So if something swims by, they might try it out, but and I am completely biased by being in love with the ocean, so saying that you're taking that risk by going in the ocean, just like when you go for a hike, you're taking a risk that a bear's going to walk by. But I think if people are aware, and you have like those calls of like the beach officials that, hey, there are sharks in the area, and if we say get out of the water, to help them. But I think that the use of nets to remove predators from their natural habitat is never good in the long run.
Chris, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I work with all the ocean lifeguards in California, and their job is to keep people safe. So there, obviously, when there's 40 juvenile white sharks hanging out off their beach, that is disconcerting, to say the least, right? And they don't know anything about sharks. They're not marine biologists. They're lifeguards, and their primary job is to keep people safe. So they come to us and they say, how do we do that? And what do we know about sharks? How dangerous is this? And science-wise, we're like, we don't have any data on that. So, we've spent the last few years trying to answer that question. And the cool thing is that they have been our partners in this work. So they've worked with us on this project. So it's not like, there's a bunch of crazy scientists out offshore doing these crazy things, trying to figure out what's going on. And then we give them the data and say, see, it's okay. You can tell the public it's okay. They're participating. So they see the data. And they're now going, oh my God, this is so overblown. The sharks are out there every day. We see them in and amongst people every single day from our drones, but the people can't see the sharks there. So it's really been drone footage that has been the most effective in changing people's opinions about the risk, right? But it comes back to this concept of risk assessment. Americans are horrible risk assessors. We're horrible at it, right? We're a very litigious society, right? So anytime anything happens, it has to be somebody or something's fault. It can't be our own, right? So getting the public educated to understand that risk is far more difficult than I would have thought, right? I can't just show people data and say, here are the data. Look how compelling they are. They're statistically significant. They're like, I don't care,
I don't care what your p-value is.
Exactly. So what I have done is I've teamed up with a psychologist, a sociologist, an education specialist, an economist, and somebody in marketing. Because I need to do something, that goes beyond just studying the behavior of these animals and saying, here's the data. So what they're helping me do is to translate that in ways that the public will understand, respond, and appreciate. And believe it or not, the sole goal is around accepting risk, measuring and accepting risk. So what is your probability of encountering a shark if you go in the water? Really high at certain beaches, like really high, like almost guaranteed. They've been in the water, so I can ask them as they come out of the water, what do you think your probability was? And they will go, I didn't see sharks. I've never seen sharks here. And then I show them drone footage of that shark swimming right by them as they get out of the surf. And they're like, holy cow, right? So it's not just the data. It's like the lifeguards. It's like for them to see it while we gather it, because seeing is believing in that case. And then their risk assessments start to change, right? And that changes with experience. It's like diving, right? So when you're a new diver, you're not going to take some new diver out to some high current deep dive and expect them to be, number one, comfortable or competent. But if they're with somebody who they trust, you might build a risk assessment that is an unrealistic one, right? But after they gain experience and they become more comfortable, now they're better to assess that risk themselves, right? So our job right now is to take the scientific data that we have, which I believe is compelling, that sharks are around people all the time and they don't even care. But how do we get them to accept that risk when they go in the water? And it's hard because while you're out there, the Jaws theme is playing in the back of your head, right? So you're by yourself, it's evening, those little hairs in the back of your neck start to stand up. You get that creepy feeling. That's a hard thing to deprogram people of, right? And maybe there's some truth in that. Maybe those little hairs are there for a reason, and our primal brains are telling us, maybe I shouldn't be out here by myself. Maybe that's not a good idea. And maybe we pay attention to those, right? So, but the goal is to at least get them to start to look at sharks differently.
That's really cool. Do you see that it's becoming more frequent for scientists to be taking such a multifaceted approach to those sort of studies? And yeah,
we're getting frustrated for doing work and not having anybody pay attention to it.
That's funny. We have a really good comment here from Bahama Bill, who I heard is going to possibly be joining us back in New York soon, which I'm really hoping. But he said, many fishers in the Bahamas are calling for culling sharks as they feel they're eating too many fish. Any advice for communicating the importance of sharks to stakeholders in fisheries or beyond the dive tourism industry?
Yeah, so this is part of this challenge, right? So whether it's educating beachgoers or surfers about sharks, educating fishers is no different, right? And remember, the reason why sharks got culled to begin with wasn't because people viewed them as a risk, is that because we viewed them as competitors. So in the early days of fishing, there was no market for shark, but they were stealing our fish. So therefore, fishermen would kill sharks just because they viewed them as competitors. Seals, sea lions, dolphins, whales, they all get the same axe that sharks did, for many of those same reasons. And in places in the Gulf, dolphins are worse than sharks in terms of stealing fish. It is absolutely 100% illegal to kill a dolphin, right? They are protected under federal law. So, but sharks are not. So that is no different. It's still frustrating to the fishers, and we understand that. But again, this is kind of getting people to understand they're part of the ecosystem, not above it. So when you get to that point, you realize, you know what? I'm going to lose a few fish to some sharks. That's going to happen. But I really like fishing. And if I want to land something, I'm probably going to have to pick up my anchor. I'm going to have to move somewhere else. And that will be the practice. But getting fishers to understand that is challenging. I'll give you an example. Guadalupe Island, right? Very cool place. You guys have all heard of that, right? It's where you get to go see the white sharks, right? It's beautiful, crystal clear water, 150 miles offshore. It's Jurassic Park, right? The way people originally found out about the sharks commercially was tuna fishermen would go out there and they would anchor behind this island. It drops off very quickly. It's very deep blue water, and they would catch 100-pound yellowfin tuna off these sport fishing boats. They would lose 1 out of every 10 to a massive adult white shark. Fishermen absolutely loved it. They thought that was the greatest thing ever, was trying to horse in a 120-pound yellowfin before the white shark bit it in half. So here's a situation where fishermen kind of were pissed off at the sharks, but at the same time viewed it as this competition between this amazing, better fisher than them, right? So, there's a way that you can use that. And we just have to figure out the right marketing tool to get that to appeal to fishers, right? So, this is going to be challenging. It's going to be difficult. Scientists and science alone will not be the solution. We're going to have to team up with educators. We're going to have to team up with advertisers, people that specialize in marketing, and that's what it'll take.
Yeah. Amanda, do you have any advice for Bahama Bill or any thoughts about it?
Yeah, I mean, working with fishermen can be a little tricky because they have this such core tradition with them. Their father took them out, their grandfather took them out, their grandmother took them out. So it really is tricky to try to change their thinking, and that the sharks aren't, like, they're competing with the sharks in a way, but really it's about the longevity of the fishery itself, which the sharks can help with, just keeping that ecosystem healthy. And it's not just about like a day of fishing, it's about generations of fishing, and just trying to convey that it's not a quick problem, that if they call for more shark culling, it can lead to like bigger problems down the road. So just trying to convince them that, you may lose out today, but in 20 years, like, you can still be out here if we don't try to drastically change the ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess my next question for you guys is how would you suggest juggling shark populations with cultural traditions? So when a lot of people hear shark culling, they're thinking a shark fin soup. It's a delicacy in other countries. Some people feel like it is part of their tradition. And how would you juggle taking that away from them, I guess?
So I guess I would argue that whether we control it or not, it's going to go away, right? Because if we don't regulate it, there won't be any more sharks to fin. And if we do regulate it because of overharvesting, then you're going to have less anyway. So it's an argument that if you want your culture to survive, then you have to think sustainably. So there's no reason why people couldn't have shark fin soup. They have to do it sustainably. So instead of just cutting the fins off the shark, you could harvest the meat, you could harvest the skin, you could harvest the livers for their oil. That's full utilization. There's nothing wrong with that as long as it can be done sustainably. We have 9 billion people on the planet to feed. Not all of them want high-end shark fin soup. Some of them just want protein that they can use to survive, right? And it can be done. Shark fisheries have been demonstrated to be sustainable. It just requires regulation.
Yeah. And Amanda, how would you further that argument, I guess? So the idea of shark finning, people cut the fins off the shark, send the shark back in to have a grand old rest of its life. And the fins can go for way more than the rest of the meat. So they're seeing it as it's more efficient. Take the fins, keep them, and keep going. They have more room for fins rather than carrying a whole shark. How would you discuss that with someone who's in that business and they're saying this is more functional for me?
Yeah, I mean, that's tricky. When you remove fins from a shark and you throw it back with all the goodness in your heart, that shark is not gonna survive. Throwing it back, I mean, you are feeding other fish, so that's a bonus, I guess, from that meat. But I think when you're navigating people's cultures, I mean, they do it with whaling as well, where indigenous tribes can continue to whale as long as they continue with their traditional practices and how they harvest whales. So I think if that could be incorporated into shark culling or like finning or shark fin soup, like they can do it in a sustainable way, like Chris was saying, but more in the traditional means that they used to hunt for hundreds of years that had that fishery sustainable. For the people whose livelihood it is now, it might be the case of trying to explain to them the impact that they're having, because right now they're just focused on the money or like feeding their families, which is totally understandable. But in that case, maybe trying to find jobs for them where they do fish research, just like how Chris is using the ocean lifeguards to do some research, just using the people who are already out there looking for sharks, instead collecting data for the government instead of killing the sharks themselves.
Yeah, that's a good approach. Dana feels like hugging a shark, as many of us do, especially in this tough talk. So those are interesting ideas for sure, in regards to cultural practices and people's tradition. It's always difficult to navigate the differences in needs and opinions between the environment and when it comes to dealing with like indigenous peoples. I guess my other question is from an economic standpoint. So there have been multiple studies done on the economic value of sharks, both alive and deceased, and I have found varying results. I won't lie. So I have found that it depends on the study that was done and the different shark species and the different locations, but there are some areas where it is seen that a live shark is valued much higher than a dead shark, in that if you're looking at the ecotourism that shark might bring in, if you're looking at the environmental benefits, it could be anywhere between 1.6 and $1.9 million per shark throughout its life. However, I have found that the value of sharks on the market globally currently is $630 million. So, and shark ecotourism brings about $314 million annually. So what would you guys say to that? The differences in, I guess, the disparity in how much money a live shark brings versus a dead shark?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think with sharks, it is really hard to pull on people's heartstrings when it comes to shark research or going looking to find sharks while you're diving or anything like that. So I think that's where like the public outreach part of it comes in, of like trying to up the economic value of ecotourism with sharks involved. Just trying to get people to care a bit more, so that way it's a bit more funded. But it is hard to destroy a whole like livelihood for people. But again, it is important. So people smarter than I can probably find a way to do it.
So I would say, as somebody who was trained as also as a fisheries ecologist, when I train students in fisheries, I have to remind them that if you're a fisheries manager, you don't manage fish, you manage people. So anytime we're managing a resource, we're actually managing people, because they're the things that influence the resource, right? And there are a variety of different ways to get people to change their behavior, because that's what you're talking about. You've got to get people to change their behavior. So you can do that economically. You can either make it costly for them, too costly. You could make it, incentivize it, make it worth their while to do something, right? Or the least effective one has been, change their heart, right? That has been the least effective, because at the end of the day, there are people that are trying to make a living off these animals, whether they be dead or alive, right? Of course, a dead animal you can only harvest once, whereas a live animal you could use over and over again. The problem with some of these things is that before we incentivize an industry, we have to make sure that it's not harming sharks in a different way in the long run, right? So there has been some research done looking at provisioning. What is the disadvantage of luring sharks in so that people can see them? Does it habituate them to people? Are you going to bring them to boats that would put people who aren't trained shark handlers or feeders at risk? There are a lot of concerns like that. And are you possibly exposing sharks to disease? Believe it or not. So if you're bringing out food, and depending where you got that food, you could be exposing them to a disease, which then spread through their population. So there are a lot of concerns that wildlife managers have in regards to these things, despite the fact that it's better than killing them, right? So we have to make sure that we kick the tires on these things and make sure that the science is good and that we're not going to do something that's going to harm. And it has to be regulated. So you have to control people's behavior to a certain extent if you're going to do that. So I think there are good opportunities there. I think that there's a lot of ways of getting fishers who were in it to kill a shark to move in the opposite direction, where they can find an industry where it's non-lethal and they still get to spend time in the ocean. They still get to keep their boats and pay their boat mortgages and all those things. But they're doing something that doesn't require killing the animal. And those things take time, because that's a culture that you have to change, right? So it becomes a little less about the economics and more about the fear of cultural loss. So cultural change takes time. And I think that's why there has to be more than just science. There has to be social scientists involved. There have to be people involved who know how to change people's behavior. And as scientists, that's not my form of science. I try to figure out why sharks do what they do. And I've found that, to be honest, sharks are far more honest, I think, than people. I find them much more straightforward and easy to interpret.
Yeah. Amanda, do you have thoughts?
I completely agree. It's very tricky to tell people what they're doing needs to change, especially if they're generations of doing it. So, I mean, you encounter that wherever you go. Like the shark sanctuary in Palau took years to implement because there was a whole industry for it there. But they took the time and they took the resources to find jobs for the people that were in that industry, and to make the regulations that were unpopular in the beginning but have turned out to, like a decade later, to be so positive for their economy, but also ecologically on their reefs. And I think having like trials like that that turned out successful really helps in the long run of convincing places that it will help in the long run if we implement these regulations and if we try to change what we're doing now to do this instead.
Yeah. And we are going to keep it short because some of us have to go, but there is one comment from Dana that I wanted to talk about that's a little bit adjacent to my original question, but he said, I always wondered if the guys feeding sharks in groups of divers will cause a negative feedback loop. I think that's something that a lot of divers don't realize when they do shark dives, that where they're like luring the sharks in. And Chris, I know you mentioned the negative, that there could potentially be negative impacts on that. Is that backed up solidly by research at this point, or what have you guys seen for like shark dives that are specifically people are chumming the water and things like that? Amanda, do you have any background with that?
I don't have too much background. I've never been on a dive where they chum the waters to bring in the sharks. But anytime that you try to entice animals to you, always poses a risk to the humans, but obviously a risk to the animals as well, because you're changing their feeding patterns that they have in the wild and are making them associate humans or associate boats with food, which they're going to remember, and they're going to possibly act on that in the future, which can put them again at harm or humans.
Yeah, so that's what most of the research shows that's been done so far, is that it does change the behavior. There's no doubt. And in some cases, there's what's called provisioning. In other words, the animals are being fed, which is different from, throwing out some odor and trying to lure sharks and then teasing them with a bait, but not really letting them get a full meal, right? So, and some people argue, well, that's better. Or at least we're not provisioning them. They're not dependent on that food source. If that food source disappears, what's going to happen to them? Basically those sharks will do fine on their own, whether they're provisioned or not. But it's the change in behavior and the way they behave around people that is the biggest concern. And the question is whether that has a long-term effect on the shark's health. So those are the things that we still don't have data on. We don't know what the long-term impacts are. We know what the short-term ones are. And there's clearly a change in behavior. But we don't know what the long-term effects are. And that's still being studied. Nonetheless, if you look at that relative to, I just killed the shark, people go, okay, that's a no-brainer, right? So that's where, at the end of the day, if you're looking at a scale, killing them is definitely the end, not good. This may be bad, but maybe in the long term, this is definitely better than that. So I think that's where most managers are kind of leaving that. And I'll give you an example. So Guadalupe, Mexico, the country just closed Guadalupe Island. There'll no longer be shark diving there. It was a very lucrative thing. I mean, people were paying $5,000 a trip to go out there. And it's one of the few places you could go and see white sharks in warm, clear water. They closed it because they were concerned that sharks were getting trapped in the cages. A few sharks died. Nobody had really gotten injured, but, sharks were clearly getting injured. They closed it. So I think that could happen in other operations. If people see a detriment to the population, they can do that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like I said, I know we got to wrap it up quick. Do you guys have any closing remarks about shark culling, or just sharks in general?
Chris, you can go first if you want.
Well, I think the exciting news for me is that despite all the bad information we hear about the environment every single day, I'm very excited to see sharks come back. I mean, they are coming back. We are seeing more sharks. That's conservation success, right? We're doing something right. But now our next step is making sure that people understand that's not a bad thing, right? And if you go to the beach and you see a shark, you really don't have to worry that much. So it's that change in perspective, right? And it's getting people to actually cheer that sharks are coming back. And for most divers, they think that's awesome. I mean, imagine my fear was 25 years ago, I was afraid that there would be an entire generation that would dive and never get to see a shark in the wild. And now in the US, that's not a problem. So I think that's a good sign. It's a hopeful sign. It means that we can fix things in our ocean. We can bring back big things. That's promising.
Definitely. Amanda, do you have closing thoughts?
Yeah, it is always nice for to get good news about moves in conservation and sustainability, which is I don't want to say rare, but sometimes some days are hard. So that is always good news to hear that they are coming back in numbers, and I think having discussions like this is just so important so that people understand how amazing these creatures are and trying to change that narrative that they've had around them for so long. And I think that that's very positive that this was the topic that you chose, and that we can have discussions like this, and that Chris could come in. And I hope that people go diving more and they talk to locals and they say, that was a great dive. I saw so many sharks. They were beautiful. And just trying to change perspectives with a cascade effect of making people excited about it.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for joining us. I think overall we've determined shark culling, not great. Sharks, great. I hope most of us knew that already, but it is definitely a good conversation to have. So thank you guys so much for joining. I'm going to throw you guys in the waiting room for just a minute. I'll say goodbye to our viewers, and then I'll be right in to say goodbye to you guys. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
All right, guys, thank you so much for joining. I know it was a short episode, but it's definitely an interesting topic. I know most of us love to see our sharky friends on our dives, but some of us are also not quite as sure. So I think this was a great talk. If you guys are watching us on YouTube, there should be like a like and subscribe button somewhere around here. Feel free to click one of those, and we will be back in a month. Thank you guys so much.